Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be exploring this really provocative idea, the ethical slut. And before you think we're promoting just, casual flings, we're actually diving deep into a book that really challenges some of those like conventional ideas about relationships.
Yeah, The Ethical Slut, a practical guide to polyamory, open relationships, and other adventures. So we'll be taking a deep dive into alternative relationship styles and sort of the philosophy behind ethical non-monogamy.
Exactly. And I'm curious, like before we even get into the nitty gritty, what first drew you to this book? What caught your eye about it?
Honestly, the title. It's a total conversation starter. I mean, it challenges so many preconceived notions about what it means to be a slut.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Dossie Easton and Janet Hardy, the authors, really reclaim that word, and they use it to kind of empower people to make conscious choices about their relationships and their sexuality.
Okay, yeah, I see how that could be both really intriguing and maybe a little intimidating for some of our listeners. So for someone who's like totally new to this, how do Easton and Hardy actually like define an ethical slut?
They define it as someone who chooses to have, multiple loving relationships, but with honesty and integrity, like at the core of everything. It's about being transparent and responsible in all your interactions, not just about like how many partners you have.
That makes sense. It's more about the approach to relationships rather than just the number of people involved.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting. One of the authors actually shares a personal story about how she identified as an independent slut in college, but then later on in life chose monogamy. So it really highlights how ethical non-monogamy is, a choice that you make, not some kind of personality trait that's set in stone.
It's interesting how relationships can evolve and change over time, and what works for us at one point might not later on. But I think for a lot of us, the idea of ethical non-monogamy, it challenges some pretty deep beliefs about love and relationships. I'm thinking about like those fairy tales where it's all about finding the one and then living happily ever after.
That's a huge part of what the book dives into.
Hmm.
It's about really deconstructing those myths about monogamy and romantic love. We're often taught that lifetime monogamy is like the only real relationship or the only valid one. But is that really serving everyone?
Yeah, it makes you wonder if all these beliefs about the one are actually limiting us and preventing us from experiencing other forms of connection and intimacy.
That's a great point to ponder. The book even uses a phrase, ought to be's, to describe all these often unspoken, societal expectations.
Okay, ought to be is interesting. So if we like throw all those ought to be's out, what does the book offer instead? What are like the main principles of an ethical slut?
They put a lot of emphasis on values like consent, honesty, self-knowledge, and taking responsibility for your actions and your emotions. It's really about building relationships on open communication and mutual respect, whether you have one partner or, several.
Those sound like good principles for any relationship, really. But I'm curious, how does the concept of abundance tie into all of this?
Well, the book kind of challenges this idea that love is like a limited resource, that there's only so much to go around. They call it a starvation economy. Like, think about your own childhood. Did you ever feel like love and attention were things you had to, compete for? And that starvation economy mindset, it can totally impact how we approach relationships as adults.
I see what you mean. If we think of love as something to be like competed for or possessed, it can lead to all that jealousy, insecurity, and that fear of losing out.
Exactly. And the author suggests embracing um, an abundance mentality instead, where love and intimacy and connection are seen as, well, limitless. And they argue that this can lead to much more fulfilling and loving relationships, even if they look different from the traditional model.
Yeah, that could be a real game changer, especially for people who maybe feel confined by the limitations of, monogamy. But I'm curious, isn't managing multiple relationships just way more complex? How do ethical sluts avoid getting totally overwhelmed by all those logistical and emotional challenges?
That's a great question. And it's definitely something that the book really gets into. It really stresses how important it is to um, develop specific skills and strategies to, navigate the complexities of non-monogamous relationships.
It's not just about freedom and flexibility, then. It's about putting in the work to create those healthy and sustainable connections.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. The book offers tons of practical advice on communication, boundary setting, and even like techniques for dealing with jealousy, which, let's face it, comes up in any relationship.
Okay, we're getting into some potentially tricky territory here, and I just want to make sure we're being sensitive to our listeners. We're talking about real emotions and maybe even some vulnerable experiences.
You're right. It's really important to approach this with empathy and respect, recognizing that everyone's journey is unique.
So let's delve into some of the book's insights about, navigating those challenges. And I guess we could start with something that comes up in any relationship, but maybe even more so in non-monogamous ones. Jealousy. What do the authors have to say about that?
Well, they have this really interesting way of looking at it. They call jealousy a potential teacher. I know, kind of
Mhm.
strange, but they acknowledge that feeling jealous is totally normal. But they really encourage people to view it as an opportunity for growth rather than a sign of failure.
So instead of trying to push those feelings down or ignore them, they're saying we should lean into them, see what we can learn from them.
Exactly. They offer all sorts of techniques for working through jealousy in a healthy way. Things like journaling, self-reflection,
Mhm.
open communication with your partners, and they even have this technique called whitewater rafting your emotions. I know it sounds a little out there.
Okay, whitewater rafting emotions. You got to tell me more about this.
Okay, well, imagine you're in a raft on like a rushing river. If you try to fight the current, you're going to get exhausted, and you might even tip over it. Right? Instead, you can learn to ride the waves. Let yourself experience the intensity without resisting it.
So you're saying it's about letting those feelings like wash over you without getting totally swept away.
Precisely. It's about recognizing the hurt or the fear behind those feelings and finding healthy ways to address them instead of, letting them control you or sabotage your relationships.
It sounds powerful, but I imagine it takes a lot of self-awareness and emotional resilience.
You're right, it's not a quick fix. The book really stresses how important it is to develop those skills, both for yourself and for your relationships to thrive.
Yeah.
And this actually leads to another super important part of ethical non-monogamy, setting clear agreements and boundaries.
Ah,
Yeah.
yes, boundaries. I mean, those are essential in any relationship, but I can only imagine they become even more critical when you're navigating multiple connections at once. What are some insights from the book on that?
Well, the authors, they really emphasize having open and honest conversations with all your partners about what you're comfortable with, what you need, and where your limits are. Basically, creating a framework for those healthy and consensual relationships that work for everybody involved.
But wouldn't all of that like create a whole bunch of rules and restrictions? Wouldn't that kind of take the spontaneity and fun out of things?
It's not about creating some kind of rule book or trying to, you know, control your partner. It's more about building a sense of security and clarity. The book even points out that these agreements, they often need to change over time as, well, people change and relationships evolve. It's about staying flexible and, adaptable and open to renegotiating things when you need to.
Finding that balance, huh?
Yeah,
Freedom and responsibility.
exactly. And they even share this example of a couple who had a very specific agreement. No sexual contact with anyone else from Sunday night through Friday morning.
So they're tailoring their agreements to fit their own unique lifestyle and, their relationship dynamic.
Exactly. What works for one couple might not work for another, and that's totally fine. It's about figuring out what creates that sense of security and comfort for everybody involved.
This all sounds great in theory, but let's be realistic. Things can still get kind of messy, right? Especially when you're opening up an existing relationship to include, other partners.
You're not wrong. The book definitely gets into all those complexities of opening up an existing relationship. And they acknowledge, the potential for jealousy, insecurity, even resentment. They actually use this analogy of a triangle to sort of illustrate all the dynamics at play.
Okay, the triangle analogy. Can you break that down for our listeners who might not be familiar with that concept?
Sure. So picture a triangle with, 3 points.
Yeah.
One point represents the adventurous partner, the one who's, excited about exploring non-monogamy.
Mm.
Another point represents the partner who chose none of this
Yeah.
and might be feeling, apprehensive, maybe even a bit pressured. And then the third point, that represents the new partner who might be feeling insecure about where they fit into all of this.
So it's not just about the adventurous partner getting their needs met. It's about making sure that everyone involved feels heard, respected, and secure in that whole dynamic.
Precisely. It's a delicate dance, and it requires a lot of empathy, patience, and willingness to, understand and respect everyone's point of view. And the book offer strategies for how to navigate those challenges, really emphasizing, clear communication, setting realistic expectations, and making sure that everyone feels safe emotionally.
It sounds like it takes a lot of communication skills and emotional intelligence.
You got it. It's all about fostering trust and understanding, even when you're, venturing into this uncharted territory.
This is super insightful, but for someone who's, intrigued by the idea of ethical non-monogamy, but feeling maybe a little overwhelmed by all the complexities, where do they even start? Do they have to just dive headfirst into, a polyamorous triad?
Oh, not at all. The book actually encourages exploration and experimentation, but it really emphasizes starting slow and finding what they call your own slut style.
Slut style. I love
Right?
that. So it's not about conforming to some, predetermined model. It's about figuring out what feels authentic and fulfilling for you as an individual.
Exactly. They talk about finding your people, communities, attending workshops, and even exploring different subcultures that, that embrace ethical non-monogamy.
Expanding your horizons, challenging those, preconceived notions about relationships and seeing what feels right to you.
They even have practical tips for things like writing personal ads, I know, those still
Yeah.
exist, and how to navigate online dating platforms that are geared toward, non-monogamous folks.
It sounds like there's a whole community out there for people who are curious about exploring these alternative relationship styles.
And what's really fascinating is how they encourage readers to learn from, diverse communities.
Yeah.
They highlight how the LGBTQ plus community, for example, has so much insight to offer on things like communication, consent, and navigating multiple relationships.
It's about, learning from the wisdom and experience of those who have been practicing ethical non-monogamy for years. But before we get into the, the practical stuff, I think it's helpful to just take a pause and reflect on what we've covered so far. We talked about challenging those deeply ingrained beliefs, embracing that abundance mentality, and developing the skills and strategies to navigate non-monogamous relationships in a responsible way. That's a lot to take in.
It really is. And it's important to acknowledge that exploring these concepts can be, both exciting and maybe a little unsettling at times. We're challenging societal norms and, potentially facing some of those deep-seated fears and insecurities about, love and relationships.
You're right. It takes courage to question the status quo and explore alternative ways of living and loving.
Absolutely. And the authors really acknowledge that. They even pose this simple but powerful question. What can you learn by thinking about all this? What makes you kind of nervous?
Ooh, that's a good cliffhanger. I definitely want to hear your thoughts on that question, and I'm sure our listeners do too. But we're going to have to save that conversation for part 2 of our deep dive into the ethical slut.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the ethical slut.
Hmm.
When we left off, we were about to unpack a question that authors pose to their readers. What can you learn by thinking about all this? What makes you kind of nervous?
Yeah, that question's been kind of swirling around in my head since we last spoke. I think for me, what makes me nervous is the potential for hurt feelings. Even if everyone has the best intentions and the communication's good, can't opening up a relationship lead to jealousy and insecurity and even resentment?
That's an honest concern and a very human one. And the book definitely doesn't shy away from these complexities. Easton and Hardy actually spend a lot of time exploring the potential pitfalls and challenges of non-monogamous relationships.
So they're not like sugarcoating it. They're acknowledging that this path takes a certain level of maturity and resilience, I guess.
Exactly. They're not just presenting ethical non-monogamy as like this utopian ideal, Instead, they're giving readers practical tools and strategies for navigating those inevitable bumps in the road.
One of those bumps, as we talked about earlier, is jealousy. And they even call it a potential teacher, which I thought was interesting. They encourage people to lean into those feelings instead of trying to just like bury them.
Yeah, and they offer a bunch of different techniques for, working through jealousy constructively. We talked about whitewater rafting, those emotions earlier, but they also talk about, really understanding the root of those jealous feelings.
It's not just about riding the wave, it's about figuring out what's causing the wave in the first place.
Exactly. They want people to ask themselves, what am I actually feeling threatened by here? Is it fear of abandonment? Is it a sense of inadequacy? Or maybe it's, feeling like you're not getting enough attention or affection.
I can see how getting to the core of those feelings could be really helpful in finding like a resolution.
And they also talk about how important it is to communicate those feelings to your partner, not in a, blaming way, but in a vulnerable and authentic way.
So being able to express your needs and your fears without giving ultimatums or trying to, control your partner's behavior.
Right. It's about having a conversation where both partners feel, heard and understood.
Mm.
And sometimes that might involve renegotiating boundaries or, agreements.
Speaking of boundaries, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how the authors approach that. It seems like clear boundaries would be essential in any non-monogamous relationship.
Oh, absolutely. The book emphasizes having those honest conversations with your partners about what you're comfortable with, what your needs are, and what your limits are.
But how do you find that balance between creating a framework for healthy relationships without being, too restrictive or imposing a bunch of rigid rules?
Well, the book makes it clear that those agreements aren't meant to be set in stone. They might need to be, revisited and renegotiated as people and relationships change. It's all about finding what works, and that might look different for every couple um, or polycule.
Polycule, that's a new one for me.
Yeah, it's a term that's used to describe a network of interconnected relationships in a polyamorous context.
Ah, okay. So it's not just about individual couples, but like a web of interconnected relationships with, different levels of intimacy and commitment.
Exactly. And navigating those dynamics takes a lot of communication and emotional intelligence. And the book provides a lot of guidance on how to, approach those conversations in a constructive way. They emphasize things like active listening, empathy, and a willingness to compromise.
They even talk about scheduling regular, like, check-in meetings with their partners just to,
Yeah.
make sure everyone has space to voice any concerns or uh, needs or anything like that.
Creating a space for, open and honest dialogue where everyone feels safe.
One thing that struck me about the book is this emphasis on personal responsibility. It's not about blaming other people for how we feel or expecting our partners to fulfill every single one of our needs.
That's such a key takeaway.
Mhm.
The authors really want readers to take ownership of their own emotions, needs, and desires. They even use the phrase doing your own work to describe that process of, self-discovery and personal growth.
So it's about recognizing that we're responsible for our own happiness and fulfillment, even in the context of a relationship.
Absolutely. It's about having a strong sense of self and really understanding what brings you joy and fulfillment.
It sounds empowering, but I imagine it can also be pretty challenging, especially for people who are, used to more traditional relationships.
It's definitely a shift in perspective. The book encourages people to let go of those, preconceived notions about what a successful relationship should look like, and instead focus on creating something that's authentic and fulfilling, even if it means stepping outside of those societal norms.
That reminds me of another concept they talk about, slut style. It's not about conforming to a certain model. It's about, finding what works for you.
Exactly, and that slut style can, evolve over time as we learn and grow.
Mm.
The book wants people to approach this with curiosity and an open mind. There's no one right way to practice ethical non-monogamy.
It's about embracing that diversity of human experience and finding what, truly resonates with your own values and desires.
And that exploration might lead you to, step outside your comfort zone and challenge some of your assumptions about love and relationships and maybe even your own identity.
I was really intrigued by how the book explores different communities that embrace ethical non-monogamy. It's not just about individual choices, it's about a broader cultural shift, I guess.
That's right. The authors talk about how the LGBTQ plus community, for instance, has all this valuable insight to offer when it comes to, communication, consent, and navigating those multiple relationships. They've been challenging those traditional relationship norms for decades and have built these amazing supportive communities that, really embrace diversity and inclusivity.
It's really interesting how different communities have kind of adopted and adapted these principles to fit their own values and lifestyles.
It really does highlight that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to this.
Yeah.
What really matters is finding what works for you and your partners and creating relationships that are built on, honesty, respect, and a genuine understanding of each other.
So the book offers some pretty practical advice for people who, are curious about exploring ethical non-monogamy. It's not just theoretical. It's about real-world application.
Definitely. They suggest things like attending workshops, joining online communities, and even exploring different subcultures that, embrace ethical non-monogamy.
So it's about connecting with like-minded people, learning from their experiences and finding a community where you feel supported and understood.
And they even talk about the nuts and bolts of, dating and forming new connections in a non-monogamous context. They talk about everything from writing personal ads to navigating online dating platforms that are specifically for people who are non-monogamous.
Expanding your social circle and being open to new possibilities for connection and intimacy.
And they really stress how important it is to be upfront about your relationship style and intentions from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Honesty and transparency, even if it means having some uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah, honesty and transparency seem to be like recurring themes throughout the book. It's not about hiding things or sneaking around. It's about creating a culture of open communication and trust.
Exactly. It's about building relationships on authenticity and mutual respect, no matter how many people are involved.
What about people who are already in, a monogamous relationship, but are curious about maybe exploring non-monogamy? How do you even begin to have that conversation with your partner without creating conflict or resentment?
That's definitely a delicate situation. And the book, acknowledges that it can be challenging. They advise starting with self-reflection. What are your motivations for, wanting to open up the relationship? What are your needs and desires?
So really understanding your own motivations before you even bring it up with your partner.
Right. And when you do have that conversation, approach it with empathy and be willing to, listen to your partner's perspective. They're going to have their own, fears and insecurities and questions.
Creating that safe space for dialogue where both people feel comfortable expressing themselves without fear of judgment or rejection.
And be prepared for the conversation to, be an ongoing thing. It might take a while for both partners to process their emotions and really come to an understanding.
It's not just a one-time conversation. It's a process of, communication and negotiation.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that opening up a relationship isn't going to, magically fix any existing problems. It might even make certain issues worse if you don't address them before making such a big change.
So being realistic about the potential challenges and being willing to do the work, whether you end up being, monogamous or non-monogamous.
And at the end of the day, the decision to open up a relationship has to be mutual. It has to be based on, shared values and desires. It shouldn't be about one partner pressuring the other to conform to their wishes.
It's about respecting each other's boundaries and finding a path that works for both people. And sometimes that path might lead in different directions.
That's a good point. The book acknowledges that not all relationships are meant to last forever, and sometimes, parting ways is actually the option for both people.
So prioritizing individual growth and happiness, even if it means letting go of a relationship that's no longer serving you.
Exactly, and that brings us back to self-awareness and personal responsibility. It's about understanding what you really want out of life and relationships and having the courage to go after those desires, even if it means challenging those societal norms.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation. We've covered so much ground from deconstructing those myths about monogamy to exploring, how to actually build healthy non-monogamous relationships. I feel like we've just scratched the surface of what this book has to offer.
Oh, for sure. The Ethical Slut is packed with insights and practical advice. It's the kind of book you can reread a bunch of times and get something new out of it every time.
And as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm left with this lingering question. How do the authors suggest navigating that social stigma that, often surrounds non-monogamous relationships? It's one thing to embrace these ideas, in your own personal life, but what about dealing with judgment or disapproval from family and friends or even society as a whole?
That's a great question, and one that deserves its own conversation. And that's exactly where we'll pick up in part 3 of our deep dive into the ethical slut.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been really digging into this world of the ethical slut, unpacking the philosophy, getting into the practical stuff. But as we explore these alternative relationship styles, I think it's time to address the elephant in the room.
You mean the social stigma that often comes with non-monogamy?
Exactly. It's one thing to embrace those principles in your own relationships, but how do you handle judgment or disapproval from your family, your friends, or just society in general?
It's a real concern. And the authors tackle it head on. They acknowledge that going against the grain like this can be isolating, especially if you're facing, criticism or just people not getting it, even from those closest to you.
So they're not painting some, perfect picture where everyone's going to understand and be totally cool with it. They're real about the challenges that come with challenging those norms.
Yeah, they remind readers that choosing ethical non-monogamy often means, really challenging those deeply ingrained beliefs about relationships and sexuality. And not everyone is going to be ready for that.
What advice do they give then for, navigating those tough conversations with loved ones who maybe aren't as open-minded?
Well, they suggest starting with yourself, asking, what are my reasons for sharing this? What kind of support am I hoping to get out of this?
Being clear about your intentions before you even start those conversations.
Exactly. And realizing that not everyone needs to be in on every single detail of your, relationship dynamics.
Setting those boundaries then, even with people you're close to, about what you're comfortable sharing and what you'd rather, keep private.
They also say it's super important to pick the right time and place. Don't drop bombshells at family gatherings or when everyone's, already stressed out.
Creating a space for dialogue where people can, feel safe and respected.
And just be prepared for some pushback. Some people have really strong opinions about, non-monogamy, and that could be from how they were raised, their own experiences, all sorts of things.
So how do you deal with those situations where people are just resistant or even judgmental?
The book says, be patient, be understanding. Change is hard, especially when it comes to beliefs that are, so ingrained.
Meeting people where they are without trying to force them to see things your way.
They suggest offering resources like books or articles for people who are genuinely curious, but maybe have some misconceptions about ethical non-monogamy.
Giving information without being, preachy or getting defensive.
Right. And knowing that you can't control how other people think or react. You can only control your own choices and how you respond to those who, maybe don't approve.
Sometimes the best thing is to just agree to disagree and focus on your relationships with people who are, supportive and accepting.
For sure. Having a community of like-minded people around you can be so validating, especially when you're dealing with criticism from the outside.
It's like that slut style idea, but beyond just romantic relationships. It's about finding your tribe, the people who, get you and celebrate your choices.
That's a great way to put it. Finding your tribe can be a lifeline, especially when you're, navigating something like ethical non-monogamy.
And it's not just about finding people who agree with you all the time. It's about having people around you who challenge you to grow, who offer different perspectives, and who support you on your journey, even if it means taking a different path.
And part of that journey might be confronting your own, internalized stigma. Even people who are drawn to ethical non-monogamy might still have those doubts or those fears that come from, what society tells us.
Unpacking those beliefs and really questioning where they come from, right?
Yeah.
Are they really your values, or are they just what you've been taught to believe?
Exactly. They want readers to challenge those oddities we talked about before, those unspoken rules about how relationships are supposed to be.
It's about realizing that those rules might not fit with what you, really want and need.
And that's where the real work starts. Unlearning those old beliefs and building a new way of looking at relationships that's based on, your own values and what you truly desire.
Sounds like a process of tearing down and building back up, getting rid of those old ideas and creating something new that reflects your own vision of love and connection.
It can be messy, definitely,
Hmm.
and it's challenging. But it can also be, really freeing. It's about taking ownership of your sexuality, your relationships, and basically writing your own story.
And that story might not always fit into the neat little boxes that society gives us. It might be unconventional, maybe even a little, scandalous.
But that's okay. The beauty of ethical non-monogamy and of life, really, is that we get to choose how we want to live.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the ethical slut, I'm feeling a mix of excitement and, a dose of reality. Ethical non-monogamy isn't some magic solution or a guarantee of happiness. It's a journey, and it takes work, self-awareness, and the willingness to, push against those conventional norms.
And it's definitely not the right fit for everyone. But for those who are curious and open-minded and willing to put in the effort, it can lead to amazing personal growth and, more fulfilling relationships.
If this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, I definitely encourage you to check out The Ethical Slut. and keep exploring. You never know, you might just discover a whole new world of possibilities for love and connection and, just expressing your true self.
And remember, the most important relationship you have is the one with yourself. So take care of that relationship, explore what you want, and create a life that feels, truly authentic.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, happy exploring.